I'm Mark Hartley, the writer-director of the documentary Not Quite Hollywood. Not Quite Hollywood looks at Australian genre cinemas. It's a study examination of a whole lot of films that came out of Australia that no one has any idea about, really. It's kind of the last bastion of genre cinema, I guess, that it's never been explored. Everyone knows about American grindhouse and hammer horror and things like that, but in Australia, we made a large number of really influential action horror films, and this is the first time that they've ever been really examined in any way. Yeah, I saw a large number of these films on television when I was a kid, and they appealed to me because they were like American genre films, but they had Australian accents and Australian locations, so I felt a connection to them. And I went to read about these films in the books, history books on Australian film, and found that they weren't even listed. So it seemed to me very early on that there was a large number of these films that really had never been documented in any way. And if anything did remain in the history books, it was the very severe critical reaction to these films. You have to understand, in Australia, in the 70s, Australian audiences embraced our art house films as our commercial films. So anything that wasn't Picnic at Hanging Rock or Getting of Wisdom were considered B-grade. And so a large number of these films played really well and made a lot of money internationally, but were never really seen as being Australian films back home. So it was a very interesting doco to make because they were crazy, wild films, and the people who made them, if there had been rules, they would have broken them. You know, they did whatever they could to get these images on screen, and it's pretty irreverent about the films that were made and the people who made them. Unlike most documentaries on film, it's not a puff piece. It's really kind of if people hated a film or they hated a person who worked on that film, they'll tell you. And there's stories about people like the director Brian Trenchard-Smith, who wanted his lead actor, who was George Lazenby, James Bond, previous James Bond, to actually set himself on fire in a scene. And to convince George to do it, Brian, the director, set himself on fire in front of the crew to show him that could easily be done. And then George did it and discovered what happens when you do set yourself on fire. You burn. So I'm not sure that happens a lot on films these days. This is a time when if they shot a car chase, they wouldn't get any kind of permission. They just go out there and do it. And if they knocked someone over with a car, they wouldn't take them to hospital. They'd give them a beer and just tell them to stand a little bit further away from the speeding car in the second take. It was just maverick, gonzo, renegade filmmaking. Most people in America know of The Road Warrior, which we know as Mad Max 2. The first Mad Max film was a film that was shot on weekends by director George Miller, who had never made a film before. He'd made a short. He was a doctor, a practicing doctor at the time. He was still going out and visiting patients in between setups. He battled a crew that really didn't understand what he wanted on screen because he didn't have any experience making films. He knew what he wanted, but he couldn't tell anyone what he wanted. So he had a crew that was against him. It was a film that was difficult to make. Stunt guys were getting hurt daily because there was no rules about how to do stuff in Australia. It was literally gonzo filmmaking. There was nothing in the law that said you could drive a car down a street, roll it, and crash it into another car. But these guys, that's what they were doing on the weekends to get their vision on screen. So when he came to Mad Max 2, he jettisoned all the crew that had worked on number 1 and started from scratch at a much higher level. And I think Mad Max 2 was a lot more controlled in terms of carnage and mayhem than Mad Max 1 certainly was. And I think that the reports of stuntmen breaking necks and all that kind of stuff was greatly exaggerated. In fact, I've been told it was because the stuntmen overseas saw this film and saw how miraculous and how incredible these stunts were that they wanted to spread rumours that people got very hurt making them, and that wasn't the case. People did certainly. There's a scene where that guy rolls over and hits his knees. Well, he certainly broke his knees, but no necks were broken because you had a doctor directing it who was constantly taking care of people. And later on, we did, we had the Superman movie and the Matrix movies all come to Australia. But I think people saw Australia as, Mexico with a mobile phone. It was a cheap place to shoot films because of the dollar. And we did have very experienced crews who had worked on a large number of films. So that did help. It was a really long process. It took about 10 years to get it made. And, but the time was right in the end because we got an amazing amount of people. both the people who, the large amount of people who made these films in Australia, and also the people from overseas who came to Australia to appear in these films. So we were lucky enough to get people like Dennis Hopper and Jamie Lee Curtis, Stacey Keach, Susanna York, Lazenby, people like that who had come to Australia to make these films, to talk about these films. And also people who had been incredibly influenced by these movies as well. Quentin Tarantino, who rips off a large number of these films in his films, spoke about his love of these films. And people like James Wan and Lee Winnell, who've made the Saw films, they also talk about their influences. So it was really interesting to me to see that these films that were considered, B-grade and tasteless in their time have actually had more influence on filmmakers these days than our more lauded and cultural films. So that was pretty interesting too. Look, it was definitely, I knew growing up as a kid and watching these films, there was a large number of filmmakers, Brian Trenchard-Smith, Richard Franklin, who went on to direct Psycho 2, these Australian filmmakers who were just as skilled in the craft of making films as our more lauded Australian filmmakers like your Weirs and your Skepsis and your Beresfords. But because they chose to work in genre, they'd never really had a spotlight shone on them. And that was part of my aims, to kind of give these guys some, not necessarily respect, maybe a bit of disrespect, but certainly give them some profile that they never had before. So it's great that that's happened as well. But look, let me just say that it's not a soul-searching study of the African yak. It is there to be just a wild, crazy ride through a whole slew of films that no one really knows about. And there's not many docos you can see on film that open you up to a whole world that you're yet to discover. So maybe that's a good thing about Not Quite Hollywood. My experiences here? Well, I've only been here a day, so I can't really talk about it, but it's great that it's finally going to screen in LA, where a larger number of these directors are now based. And it's going to be interesting to see how the... Look, there was a real Australian energy to these films that hopefully we captured in this documentary. It'd be interesting to see how that translates to an American audience. I look forward to seeing that. The strange thing here is that I don't at all consider myself a documentary filmmaker. I hadn't made documentaries before this. I had a music video background. And I continued making music videos while I was doing the research and trying to get this film up. So in a way, I never really thought that I was making a documentary, and people who are documentary filmmakers, I'm sure, will agree with me when they see the doco, because it is wildly undisciplined. I like to think that it had more of a rock and roll sensibility. So I brought all the experience that I had making music videos, stretching that out to 100 minutes, and in a way telling it as a rockumentary. All I can say is that ultimately, if you have a passion, you'll get it made. And we were lucky to find people who shared that passion, who did help us. And we were lucky enough that Tarantino was one of those. He was a guy that I'd totally given up on the project. But I knew that he had an interest in Australian exploitation films. So I sent him, emailed his assistant my research pages, about 100 pages of research material, because I knew that he'd be interested in reading them. It wasn't about enticing him to help us, because I'd given up. The project was dead in the water at that point. And it was Tarantino reading that stuff and getting back to us saying, whatever you need to do, I'll help. Come over, I'll shoot an interview with you. That ultimately rekindled my passion for the project, and eventually led to distributors in America and in the UK giving us pre-sales that ultimately helped trigger the rest of the finance. So you never know what's going to help you get the film made. And it comes from the most unlikely of sources. You just got to keep that passion going and finding kinship with people who have similar passions. And, ultimately it'll happen. I'm Mark Hartley, the director of Not Quite Hollywood, and I've been forced at gunpoint to say that AFI rocks.